Chapter 1. The Last Breath of a King On. The mist-laden morning of June 26, 1830, the halls of Windsor Castle carried a silence heavier than any bell toll. Courtiers moved in whispers, servants tiptoed down endless corridors, and physicians exchanged grim glances, knowing that within the chamber at the heart of the palace, the once mighty George IV, King of Great Britain and Ireland, was living the final moments of a life that had spiraled into decay and disgrace. The man lying propped against silk pillows was no longer the radiant figure who had once charmed the nation. His body was a grotesque shadow of its former self. Swollen from decades of indulgence, grotesquely bloated to the point where movement was nearly impossible, layers of fat pressed down upon his failing organs, each breath a torturous labor. His face, once admired for its symmetry and charm, had become puffed and pale, the skin sagging and cracked like worn parchment. His eyes bulged faintly, ringed by shadows that betrayed endless nights of agony. The stench in the chamber was unbearable, masked feebly by incense and flowers brought daily by attendants. Even loyal courtiers could not conceal their horror. To see a king, who had once been the embodiment of refinement and taste, reduced to such a state of ruin, was to confront mortality in its most unflinching form. George's body had become a prison, his limbs trapped by obesity, his skin raw from sores hidden beneath expensive linens. But worse than the physical torment was the isolation. For years, George had courted public adoration with grand balls, extravagant feasts, and a relentless pursuit of pleasure. Now, abandoned by the people, spurned by his subjects, and estranged from much of his own family, the king faced death alone. Whispers among the nobility were merciless. He was a monarch who had squandered his crown's dignity, a man mocked as much as he had once been admired. That final night, June 25th, was a storm within his body. Physicians crowded around his bed as he slipped in and out of delirium, his massive chest heaving like a drowning man's. He clawed weakly at the sheets, choking on air that would not fill his lungs. The once melodious voice, known in his youth for wit and eloquence, had become a series of guttural gasps and half-formed words. Outside the chamber, the world awaited the inevitable. Messengers stood ready to gallop with the news, clergymen prepared their sermons, and Parliament braced for a reign's end. Yet within, time slowed to the rhythm of his failing heartbeat. In rare moments of lucidity, George's mind wandered through fragments of memory. He saw himself as a boy, full of promise, his father George III lecturing him sternly on duty. He saw flashes of his own radiant youth, bright eyes, gilded uniforms, admirers swooning at his charm. And then came the other visions. Nights blurred by wine, whispered scandals in candlelit rooms, endless banquets where he gorged himself to mask emptiness he could never fill. There was bitterness, too. He recalled the mocking songs of the public, the satirical prints that caricatured his swelling figure, the cheers that turned to jeers whenever his name was mentioned. He had been a patron of art, architecture, and elegance, yet to the people he was a gluttonous figure of ridicule. In those fleeting recollections, George tasted regret like gall on his tongue. The physicians tried every remedy, every tincture known to them. Laudanum, bleeding, herbal poultices. None could reverse the inevitable. His body, long overburdened, had reached its breaking point. Each wheeze and spasm was a battle already lost. Shortly after dawn on June 26th, the room grew still. Courtiers bent their heads as the king's last breath rattled in his throat. His chest heaved once more, then fell silent. The silence lingered, broken only by the muffled sob of a servant who had known him since youth. The physicians stepped back, their faces pale. The monarch of an empire, a man who had lived in relentless pursuit of pleasure and display, had died in a state so wretched it was difficult to reconcile with the grandeur of his crown. When the announcement was made, it was not met with grief, but with a strange mixture of relief and indifference. To many, George IV had long ceased to be a king in spirit, living more as a grotesque relic of indulgence. His death was inevitable, the manner of it, grotesque. Few mourned deeply. The nation prepared to move on, almost eager to forget the spectacle of his decline. The autopsy would reveal what the eye had already guessed. His body had been crushed from within, his organs strangled by vast layers of fat. It was a death as humiliating as it was painful, a final chapter in a reign that had begun with promise but collapsed under the weight of excess. Thus ended the life of George IV, once the Golden Prince, now remembered as the king who consumed himself, leaving behind a legacy of art, architecture, scandal, and shame. Chapter 2. Excess and Scandal. As George entered his early 20s, the world seemed to bend under his whims. Once a charming, clever boy, he had grown into a man whose figure had ballooned, a grotesque monument to indulgence. His face, once handsome, now sagged with the weight of countless feasts, and his small, piggy eyes glittered with mischief and arrogance. Each morning began with a breakfast so enormous it required several tables, mountains of pastries, fruits, meats, and jugs of wine. Courtiers and servants scurried tirelessly, fearing the wrath of a man who had grown as tyrannical. As he was corpulent, the young king, or at this point Prince Regent, surrounded himself with the most extravagant pleasures imaginable. Entire halls were lined with gilded tables, groaning under delicacies from across Europe. Platters of roast meats, mountains of pastries, and fountains of wine flowed endlessly. Musicians played continuously, while dancers and jesters performed, to amuse the indulgent prince. Even the pets of the palace, prize peacocks and hounds, were adorned in miniature royal garments, paraded for his amusement. Laughter, loud and brash, often echoed across the marble floors like the toll of a grotesque bell, masking the emptiness within. Yet amidst the chaos of his indulgence, one event defined George's notoriety: his marriage to Caroline of Brunswick. The alliance, politically advantageous, was intended to produce an heir, but George viewed it with thinly veiled disdain. The young princess, elegant and cautious, approached the marriage with dignity, only to encounter a husband who mocked, belittled, and tried to publicly humiliate her. On their first day together, George's corpulent frame dominated the bedchamber, a ridiculous contrast to Caroline's graceful form. His leering, crude remarks and dismissive laughter set the tone for a union that would become infamous. Despite the outward splendor, George's inner life was a mix of paranoia and indulgence. He mistrusted his advisors and courtiers, fearing plots against him, while simultaneously demanding constant admiration. His obsessions grew increasingly absurd: golden snuff boxes encrusted with diamonds, shoes embroidered with precious metals, and velvet robes heavier than most could lift. The Prince Regent's parties became legendary, attended by Europe's elite, yet whispered about in every corner of London. Tales of his absurd excesses and cruel mockery of his wife spread, making him both feared and ridiculed. Caroline, trapped in this gilded cage, endured the daily torment with silent dignity, observing her husband's grotesque habits and the way he treated his servants, courtiers, and even children with disdain or ridicule. Meanwhile, George's health deteriorated. Each excess, each meal, and each indulgence seemed to pull him further from humanity. What had once been intelligence and charm was now overshadowed by greed, gluttony, and vanity. The young prince, who could have been a symbol of progress and sophistication, had instead become a living caricature, laughed at by some, despised by most, and pitied by none. This period of George's life became a legend of excess and humiliation, a cautionary tale of indulgence unchecked by responsibility. The palace itself mirrored his decline: ornate halls filled with the scent of roasted meats, wine, and perfume, golden furniture worn from use, tapestries depicting grandiose scenes, overshadowed by the grotesque spectacle of their master. Every day, the line between festivity and grotesque spectacle blurred, leaving a lasting image of a king consumed entirely by himself, fat, ugly, and utterly alone in his excess. Chapter 3. The height of excess and public scorn. George IV, now fully ensnared in the trappings of his own indulgence, had transformed from the once charming prince into a monarch whose very presence evoked shock and disdain. The corridors of Carlton House echoed daily with the cacophony of feasting, laughter, and music. But these sounds were hollow to the observers who noted the monarch's grotesque figure, swelling with layers of fat that hung over the seats and made chairs groan under his weight. Every step he took seemed labored, every gesture sluggish. His once elegant hands were now puffy and reddened, fingers thick with rings, some almost lost in folds of skin. Meals were spectacles of grotesque excess, enormous platters of roasted meats, pies oozing with gravy, and rivers of sauces lined the long dining tables. The king's appetite was insatiable, and he would demand course after course, drinking claret and brandy in quantities that left even the most hardened courtiers astonished. Servants scuttled to replenish goblets, while whispered commentary about his corpulence traveled swiftly among the staff. Yet George remained impervious, laughing loudly at jokes, waving a hand to dismiss any concern, or occasionally snapping at those who dared advise moderation. His private chambers, however, told a more tragic story. The king spent hours slumped in ornate chairs, his limbs spilling over cushions, skin damp with perspiration. He experimented with opiates, often taking laudanum to soothe the aches of a body betrayed by years of gluttony and inactivity. Nights were restless, plagued with wheezing breaths, dreams filled with paranoia, and visions of enemies lurking in shadows. Yet in public, he maintained a facade of pomp and grandeur, draped in robes of velvet and silk, a crown perched atop a swollen, sagging face, painted to hide jaundice and the pallor of disease. The scandal of his personal life continued unabated. Caroline of Brunswick, his estranged wife, remained a thorn in his side. Despite attempts to isolate her from court and smear her reputation, rumors of her dignity and adversity only inflamed public sympathy. Caricatures depicting the obese king's grotesque eating habits or exaggeratedly inflamed temper appeared in pamphlets sold to the masses, fueling ridicule. On streets of London, children would shout crude rhymes mocking the monarch, and even those seeking favor at court whispered with barely concealed derision. Despite this, George's obsession with culture and the arts persisted. He commissioned architectural marvels, patronized painters, and adored music, filling his residences with trophies of taste and wealth. Yet these pursuits did little to improve the image of a king seen increasingly as a cautionary spectacle, a man consumed by appetites, vanity, and self-delusion. Courtiers maneuvered carefully around him, balancing flattery with fear of provoking his capricious anger. The monarch's staff grew thin with exhaustion, perpetually catering to his whims, whether fetching the latest delicacy, rearranging furniture for comfort, or concealing signs of physical decay from visiting dignitaries. Over time, George's physical state worsened. Edema distorted his legs and arms, breathing became labored, and the once bright eyes dulled under layers of fat and exhaustion. His mind, while still sharp in moments of reflection, often floated in haze, clouds of opiates mingling with fatigue and self-pity. In rare intervals, a flicker of remorse crossed his features, a memory of the charming prince he once was, juxtaposed against the hulking figure now regarded with horror. Yet these moments were fleeting, quickly replaced by cravings and the constant pursuit of indulgence. The king's paradoxical existence, adored in some circles for taste and culture, despised in others for vice and excess, continued to dominate public fascination. Newspapers reported his missteps with relish, chronicling not just political irrelevance but the grotesque spectacle of a king undone by indulgence. Every banquet, every public appearance became fodder for rumor and satire, immortalizing George IV not as a monarch of achievement, but as a cautionary tale of self-destruction. As the 1820s progressed, it became impossible to ignore the physical realities of his decline. He required assistance to move, meals were sometimes forced upon him, and the king's personal dignity deteriorated alongside his body. Yet George remained a figure of fascination, a man whose excesses, taste, and tyrannies intertwined to form a living emblem of the dangers of indulgence, vanity, and neglect of duty. Every laugh, every bite, every decree reinforced his image, a monarch trapped in the consequences of a life lived solely for pleasure, finally paying the inexorable toll of mortality. Chapter 4. Decline and Isolation. By the mid-1820s, King George. IV's body had become a tangible manifestation of the consequences of excess. No longer able to move freely, he relied on attendants to assist him in the simplest tasks. His once firm, handsome frame had swollen into grotesque proportions, his cheeks red and sagging, double chin rolling over his thick gold-embroidered robes. Veins protruded on his bloated arms and hands, which trembled slightly as he lifted a goblet or gestured toward a servant. Private chambers, once centers of elegance, now bore witness to the king's frailty. Opulent furniture had to be reinforced to withstand his immense weight, while tables groaned under mountains of food prepared for his insatiable appetite. Platters of roasted meats, pies, and puddings, along with bottles of fine wines and brandy, were consumed at alarming rates, often by a single sitting. The king's breathing was labored, punctuated with wheezes and coughs as he reached for another serving, oblivious to the growing stench of his own sweat and the damp warmth that clung to his skin. The influence of laudanum and other opiates on his declining mental state was profound. In long stretches of the day, George drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes forgetting the presence of his attendants or the meals placed before him. He would nod off mid-conversation, only to awake suddenly, demanding a new dish, a new musical performance, or a particular courtier's presence. These lapses further diminished the respect of those around him, transforming even his closest advisors into nervous, subservient figures who dared not contradict his whims. Yet, paradoxically, George maintained a keen interest in the arts and courtly culture. He continued commissioning paintings, sculptures, and architectural projects, often from his bed, issuing orders through hurried scribbles or shouted commands. While his physical form deteriorated, his obsession with appearances never waned. Elaborate fabrics, gilded furniture, and sparkling chandeliers were meticulously arranged to impress visiting dignitaries, masking the fragility that lay beneath the surface. The king's vanity, however, was continually undermined by the public's growing awareness of his condition. Satirical prints, gossip columns, and caricatures exaggerated his weight, deformities, and gluttony, cementing an image of a monarch grotesque and pathetic. Interpersonal relationships, especially with his estranged wife Caroline, were marked by further scandal. Despite attempts to keep her at a distance, she remained a figure of intrigue, and rumors of her dignity in contrast to George's decay spread through the capital. His public appearances, meant to assert power and presence, became exercises in humiliation, as the crowd sneers and whispers emphasized the physical toll of years spent in excess. The monarch's reaction was a volatile mix of irritation, denial, and occasional outbursts, leaving his courtiers walking a tightrope of fear and flattery. The king's daily routine oscillated between indulgence, isolation, and fragmented activity. Early mornings were spent reclining in bed or chair, staff attending to personal hygiene, followed by prodigious meals served in his chamber. Afternoons alternated between brief moments of attention to arts or politics and extended periods of dozing, often with the company of physicians who monitored his failing heart and swelling limbs. Night brought restless slumber, punctuated by coughing fits, hallucinations, and vivid dreams that mirrored his anxieties, his past pleasures, and the looming specter of mortality. As George's physical decline became increasingly public, his image transformed into a living cautionary tale. While still formally recognized as a monarch, his authority waned under the weight of his body and the public scorn. The once vibrant prince, the patron of arts and culture, now existed as a figure of spectacle, a grotesque reminder of the dangers of indulgence and neglect. Courtiers and servants alike navigated his environment with care, simultaneously serving his whims and concealing signs of his physical limitations. Despite all this, George clung to the rituals and grandeur of monarchy. Elaborate meals, ceremonial clothing, and luxurious surroundings persisted, though they served more as props in a theater of denial than as expressions of power. Each day, he oscillated between fleeting moments of awareness, recollection of his past vitality, and the all-consuming grip of desire for pleasure and opiate relief. The king's life had become a cycle of excess, embarrassment, and isolation, his personal decline mirrored by a public fascination that bordered on horror. Chapter 5. The waning splendor of a monarch by the 1820s King George IV's life had transformed from one of flamboyant indulgence to a grotesque spectacle of decline. His once handsome features had been overtaken by the excessive weight he carried, making each step a laborious effort. The king's corpulence had reached monstrous proportions. His abdomen sagged and pressed upon his chest, making every breath a struggle. The courtiers whispered behind closed doors about the sight of him wobbling through corridors, a figure more like a caricature than a sovereign. The palaces themselves, architectural marvels brimming with art and history, now felt oppressive. The grand chandeliers cast pale light across vast halls that had grown silent, except for the wheezing exhalations of a man chained by his own appetites. Rooms that once hosted dazzling balls and elegant dinners were now spaces of discomfort and pity. The king's obsession with luxury and food persisted even in his illness. Tables groaned under mountains of delicacies, roasted meats, pies laden with sugar, and exotic fruits imported from faraway colonies. Servants hovered anxiously, unsure whether to indulge his whims or restrain him, knowing that every indulgence brought him closer to ruin. George's evenings followed a predictable cycle of excess. Banquets stretched late into the night, accompanied by rum, brandy, and the occasional indulgence in opium to ease the pain of his swelling joints and troubled heart. His health, always fragile due to years of excess, now betrayed him entirely. Ascending even a short flight of stairs became a monumental task. The king would pause frequently, clutching the banisters, beads of sweat glistening on his brow. Nights offered little solace as sleep was frequently disturbed by labored breathing and bouts of nausea, the echoes of his overindulgence haunting him even in rest. Despite his failing body, George maintained an obsession with appearances. He surrounded himself with mirrors and ornate furnishings, attempting to mask his rotund form with elaborate robes and sashes. Yet the reflection staring back at him offered no comfort, only the harsh reality of flesh stretched and sagging, the visage of a man who had surrendered to pleasure and vanity. Courtiers, while outwardly deferential, could not hide their disgust. Whispers of mockery threaded through the palace corridors, stories of the king's grotesque meals and opulent vices spreading like wildfire among those who once revered him. Even the king's relationships bore the strain of his decline. Friends and confidants once eager to join in his revelries began to avoid the grotesque spectacle of his daily existence. Old rivalries resurfaced, and even members of his own family treated him with a mixture of fear and disdain. The marriage that had once cemented his social standing now provided little solace. Estrangement and misunderstanding marked the interactions between George and his estranged queen. Loneliness settled upon him as the opulent walls closed in. A gilded cage filled with echoes of former glory, the king's medical state grew ever more dire. Swelling in his legs and abdomen worsened, rendering him nearly immobile. His skin, stretched tight over layers of fat, became pallid and blotchy. Opium provided only temporary relief from the pain of his failing body, and the physicians attending him whispered grim prognoses. They noted the compression of internal organs beneath mountains of adipose tissue, the shortness of breath that left him gasping, and the near-constant fatigue that marked every movement. Yet George, in moments of stubborn pride, continued to demand the luxuries of life, refusing to relinquish the habits that had brought him both pleasure and ruin. As the years pressed on, the line between vanity and horror blurred. George's courtrooms and galleries, once alive with music, laughter, and applause, became silent theaters where the king's grotesque figure dominated every scene. Servants and visitors alike were caught between awe and revulsion, aware of history unfolding in slow, humiliating decline. Each day brought the king closer to the inevitable, his life a cautionary tableau of excess and neglect, a reminder that indulgence without restraint exacts a merciless toll. Amid the decay, George retained his love for art and architecture, though these pursuits could no longer distract from the encroaching shadow of mortality. Sketchbooks lay abandoned, grand plans for renovations paused, as the weight of years and corpulence sapped both energy and interest. He remained a king in name, yet in presence and function, a man imprisoned by his own body, a sovereign trapped in a flesh-and-bone vessel betraying his spirit. By the 1820s, King George IV existed as a paradox, a monarch surrounded by opulence, yet imprisoned by decadence, adored by history, yet mocked in the whispers of the living. Every meal, every gown, every indulgence was both a testament to his refined tastes and a marker of his inexorable decline. His final years were a careful balancing act between pleasure and mortality, a slow descent into the shadows of the very life he had cultivated with such passion. Chapter 6. The Final Decline of George V. The summer of 1830, King George IV's health had deteriorated to a state few could have imagined. His massive frame, once a symbol of indulgence and royal presence, now betrayed him, each breath a struggle, each step a monumental effort. Swelling had overtaken his legs, his abdomen protruded grotesquely, and the pallor of his skin contrasted painfully with the opulent robes he still wore. Physicians were in constant attendance, their faces etched with worry as they monitored his failing organs and attempted remedies that offered little relief. Opium, which had become both solace and torment, barely eased the relentless aches. The king's days merged into nights, the once lively palace now a silent hall of dread. Courtiers whispered in corners, fearful of drawing his attention, while servants moved with cautious precision, ensuring that even his slightest discomfort was attended to. George IV, often delirious, called out for lost companions or imagined grievances, his voice a haunting echo in the ornate chambers that had once witnessed grandeur and laughter. Meals were scarce. What he could ingest was minimal, and even that often turned to nausea and pain. His body, weighed down by decades of excess, betrayed him utterly. Skin stretched and mottled, joints stiff, eyes sunken yet still alert in fleeting moments of lucidity. He remembered the past, the extravagant balls, the tumultuous marriage with Caroline, the public scorn. But these recollections brought no joy, only a hollow ache for a vitality long gone. The royal family, torn between duty and shame, attempted to maintain appearances, but the decay of the king's health was undeniable. Every movement was laborious, every breath a battle. As the days drew closer to the end, George IV lay more often in bed, rarely speaking, surrounded by somber figures who tried to provide dignity and comfort where little remained. His final hours would come quietly, the once magnificent monarch, reduced to a man consumed by his own body, a stark reminder of the impermanence of indulgence and power. Chapter 7. The Final Decline, 800 to 1,000 words. King George IV's final days were a relentless descent into frailty and isolation. The once celebrated monarch, whose flamboyant lifestyle had defined an era of indulgence and excess, now found himself trapped within the confines of his own decaying body. The corridors of Windsor and Carlton House echoed less with laughter or music than with the groans and wheezes of a man struggling under the weight of his own flesh. Every step was labored. Even rising from his bed demanded Herculean effort, and the king's eyes, once sparkling with vanity and charm, now mirrored only exhaustion and despair. His physicians, who had long been powerless against his insatiable appetite for rich foods, alcohol, and opiates, administered countless remedies, many of them harsh and experimental. Liniments, poultices, and doses of laudanum were given with mechanical precision, yet each failed to arrest the slow decay. George's skin was sallow and stretched over layers of fat that made movement cumbersome. His breathing was often shallow, interrupted by coughing fits that left him gasping for air, and the court whispered of the odorous cloud that now seemed to follow him everywhere, a physical manifestation of neglect, age, and vice. Despite his condition, the king's vanity remained stubbornly intact. He demanded elaborate mirrors, his attendants polishing them constantly so that he could observe his reflection. He insisted on wearing opulent robes, though the fabrics clung awkwardly to his bloated form, and he fussed over jewelry and crowns, as though each ornament could disguise the ravages of time and indulgence. Those closest to him noted the tragic absurdity. A man so consumed by his own image, yet so powerless to maintain the dignity it once commanded. Social visits became increasingly rare, as even the most loyal courtiers feared the unpredictable whims of a king debilitated and irritable. Friends who had once been charmed by his wit or dazzled by his knowledge of the arts now tiptoed through his apartments, afraid to provoke the slightest annoyance. Letters arrived sporadically from diplomats and foreign dignitaries, their words, polite but strained, aware that George's once formidable influence had been hollowed by illness and scandal. Meals, which had once been celebrated with excess, had transformed into exercises in frustration. George could consume only small portions, before discomfort set in. Yet he demanded multiple courses, often insisting on elaborate dishes that he could no longer tolerate. The cooks of the royal kitchens, who had once reveled in his extravagant feasts, now tiptoed around his declining appetite, their creations often untouched, a testament to both loyalty and fear. Sleep became sporadic. Nights were punctuated by restless thrashing, groans, and occasional delirium. Servants whispered of the moments when the king, half-conscious and muttering fragments of poetry or complaints about court etiquette, would suddenly appear lucid enough to recall events from decades past. These glimpses of his former intellect were bittersweet, reminders of a once vibrant mind now trapped in a body betrayed by indulgence and neglect. By early June 1830, the king's condition deteriorated rapidly. Swelling of his limbs made walking nearly impossible. His hands shook with weakness, and his voice, once commanding, had become a faint rasp. Even the once celebrated charm of his speech was replaced by incoherence and irritation, leaving his attendants both fearful and heartbroken. Physicians documented every change meticulously, aware that the king's death was not just imminent, but a prolonged spectacle of decline, an almost ritualized demonstration of human frailty. In these final days, George's reflection on his life was unclear. When he occasionally spoke to those present, it was in fragments. Regrets for past excesses, complaints about betrayals real or imagined, and fleeting concern for his legacy. The crown, the palaces, the grandeur, all seemed irrelevant to a man whose body refused to cooperate. The court, already cautious, became somber, understanding that the age of George IV was drawing to a miserable, inevitable close. Yet in this fragility, there remained the echoes of a man who had once shaped the cultural and architectural landscape of England, who had championed the arts, whose extravagant tastes had left lasting impressions in marble and canvas. His legacy, though marred by scandal and ridicule, would endure in the opulent structures and grand galleries that had defined his reign. But for George himself, the final weeks were a lonely struggle. A king confronting the relentless toll of indulgence, the irony of a life spent in pursuit of pleasure ending in isolation, physical torment, and the erosion of every charm he had once wielded so effortlessly. Chapter 8. The Final Days of King George IV. 900 words. The last days of King George IV were a culmination of decades of indulgence, vanity, and neglect of his own health. By early June 1830, the once flamboyant monarch, whose life had been filled with extravagant feasts, lavish parties, and endless pursuit of pleasure, had become almost unrecognizable. His enormous frame, swollen and immobile, betrayed the relentless toll of years spent in excess. Each breath was a labor, each movement an ordeal. Courtiers whispered nervously, knowing that the king's body had betrayed him utterly, leaving only the remnants of a man once adored and feared. His chambers, usually vibrant with the presence of attendants, physicians, and the sounds of royal life, were now eerily quiet. The corridors, adorned with golden frames and rich tapestries, echoed the faint wheezing of the king, a cruel reminder of how the grandeur of his surroundings contrasted sharply with his own decay. Physicians monitored him constantly, their expressions a mixture of professional concern and suppressed dread. They marveled at the sheer size of his body, noting how layers of fat had compressed his organs, leaving him weak, breathless, and increasingly delirious. Potions, tinctures, and rudimentary treatments were administered with the hope of temporary relief, but they could not reverse decades of abuse and neglect. Family visits were rare, and even those closest to him could not approach without being repulsed by the sight and smell of his deteriorating form. The once powerful king, whose presence commanded obedience and awe, now inspired pity and horror. He drifted between moments of lucidity and deep lethargy, often mumbling incomprehensible fragments of his memories, longing for the glory days of his youth when he had been charming, admired, and feared. These fleeting memories tormented him, for they contrasted starkly with his present frailty and the looming shadow of death. On June 25th, the king's condition worsened rapidly. His breathing became labored, and his already swollen limbs grew more bloated. The attendants worked frantically to adjust his pillows and cushions, fearing that any sudden movement could exacerbate his suffering. Physicians hovered, discussing the grim reality in hushed tones, aware that the king's organs were failing under the immense pressure of accumulated fat and years of neglect. His once regal face, now puffy and pale, bore the expression of someone caught in a permanent limbo between life and the inevitable end. Throughout the day, King George IV alternated between brief moments of coherence, where he attempted to issue commands in a weak voice, and long stretches of semi-consciousness. His breathing, shallow and irregular, punctuated the heavy silence of the royal chambers. The candles flickered against the walls, casting elongated shadows that danced across the ornate furniture, mirroring the grotesque transformation of a king whose physical form no longer reflected the power he once wielded. Courtiers, unable to endure his presence for long, lingered at a respectful distance, while the palace staff prepared for the worst, arranging the king's bed and chambers with a mixture of reverence and dread. As night fell, King George IV's delirium intensified. He spoke sporadically of past triumphs, of courtly flattery, of feasts that now seemed impossibly distant. Yet even in these moments his body betrayed him. The king struggled to remain upright, the weight of his own flesh pinning him to the bed. Physicians administered what they could, but the signs were unmistakable. The king's days were numbered, and the end was imminent. Outside, the palace gardens were serene, untouched by the suffering within, a cruel contrast to the human misery inside the walls. At dawn on June 26th, the king passed away quietly, though not without struggle. His death was both tragic and anticlimactic, marking the end of a life defined by excess, indulgence, and the pursuit of pleasure above all else. The examination afterward revealed the devastating extent of his physical deterioration. Organs, compressed by immense fat, the heart weakened and fragile, a body that had been gradually consumed by indulgence. Though feared and often ridiculed in life, King George IV's passing left an undeniable mark on history, a somber lesson in the consequences of unchecked decadence and the fragility of human mortality.